Alrighty, let's get rolling. So, good morning, everyone. Thanks for hopping on today. I know that some of you might have been expecting Corey McCurry today, so I'm sorry to disappoint. You're stuck with me for today's webinar. So first, I want to say thank you so much for taking the time to join us. I know that your time is valuable, especially during the busy season, so I just appreciate you hopping on. Today, we're going to be talking about adding a bee-friendly solution to your toolbox for managing common chewing insects in the landscape. And before we get started, we're going to go over just a couple housekeeping slides. First thing, please type any questions that you have into the Q&A box using your control panel. I'll answer these questions at the end of the webinar if we have time. This webinar is being recorded and it will be sent out as a link about 2 days after today's event. You will be getting one ISA CEU for this live broadcast. So thanks a lot for hopping on. You will be getting CEUs for this. After the webinar, Rainbow will submit your certification number to ISA on your behalf. So there's nothing that you have to do, no actions that you have to take. When you registered, you should have provided that ISA CEU and we will submit that on your behalf. If you didn't enter your ISA CEU when you registered, please go ahead and type it into the Q&A box now, not the chat, the Q&A box. The chat box will be disabled for the duration of this presentation. So with that out of the way, let's get started. Again, we're going to be talking about adding a bee-friendly solution to your toolbox. And again, when we talk about integrated pest management or when we talk about solutions in the landscape, we're always talking about this toolbox that we have that we want to build out. Unfortunately, there's no one solution that will solve every problem in the landscape. There's no one perfect solution. So we're going to step through another solution that you can add that is bee-friendly, and some people call it pollinator-friendly, to your toolbox for your landscape management problems. So just introduce myself. My name is Kendra Wagner. I'm a research scientist at Rainbow Ecoscience. Essentially what I do at Rainbow is I run field trials. I try and find innovative solutions. I do field research really across the country, and then I also help to develop new products, protocols, and equipment. That's my phone number right there, as well as the contact information for our Solutions Center. So please feel free to reach out to me at any point. I also have a QR code at the end of the presentation that will add me directly as a contact to your phone. So here's a little bit of a roadmap for our talk today. We just did a welcome and introduction, a little bit of a learning objective review here in a minute. We're going to start with a general overview of chewing pests, okay? And my background is in entomology, so I always like to take a minute and nerd out about the insects itself before we dive into actually introducing Diamid as a product. We're going to talk about Diamid, we're going to talk about its strengths and where you can use it. We're going to introduce how you can integrate this into your current IPM program. And then finally, we'll go over some data and some case studies and some examples. And then at the end, we'll wrap up with some key takeaways and hopefully have some time for some questions. So getting us started with an overview of chewing pests. Now, insects are one of the most diverse groups of beings that exist on the planet. And we like to kind of group them into different groups, okay? Sometimes we group them into beetles versus true bugs or bees or ants. And then sometimes we like to group them into what we call their feeding guilds. Feeding guilds is essentially where the insect feeds on the plant, so where it gets most of its food for the majority of its lifetime. Now, feeding guilds is especially with landscape plants. So landscape plants that we are dealing with and what we are managing day to day. There are typically 4 main feeding guilds that we'll group insects into when we're discussing landscape pests. The first one being piercing sucking. So a lot of our scale insects fall into this group. These insects are the insects that have a piercing sucking mouth part, and they pierce into the plant and are able to suck up the juices of the plant using that piercing sucking mouth part. The next feeding guild that we use is the feeding guild of leaf chewing insects. So these are defoliating insects. These are insects that go out to the leaves and consume the leaf tissue. We also use the classification of stem and twig boring insects. So these are things like bark beetles or things like emerald ash borer or Japanese longhorn beetles. And then finally, leaf mining insects. So these are the insects that feed between the epidermis of the leaf and mine out all of the contents of that leaf. Today, specifically, we're going to be talking about leaf chewing insects because that's where Diamid is able to have the most efficacy with some of these landscape issues. When we're talking about feeding guilds, I always like to bring up this figure, and this might be familiar to some of you if you've attended some of my talks in the past. But this is a figure from a publication that looks at the different factors that cause plant decline in the landscape, okay? So we're looking at all of the things that can cause a plant to go from very healthy, newly planted, flush plant to either dead or in significant decline. Now, we like to group these into three different groups, one being predisposing factors, so the factors that predispose this plant to just declining, the other one being inciting factors, and then the last one being contributing factors. Predisposing factors include things like old age, air pollution, urban environment, genetic potential, things that will just naturally predispose a plant to declining or dying in the landscape. The next one being inciting, those include things like excavation, drought, excessive salt, frost, and air pollution. And then finally, contributing factors. So these are the things that will significantly contribute to decline in an urban plant. And those include things like nematode, viruses, wilt, and wood and bark boring insects. And then we can see in the middle the death of that plant will occur. And the two things that I like to draw attention to with a figure like this are defoliating insects and wood and bark boring insects. So we can see based on this figure that these insects play a vital role in not only the health, but actually the longevity of the plant to live in an urban environment, okay? And again, today we're going to be talking about defoliating insects. So there are three main types of foliar feeding that we typically see in urban plants. The first one being leaf chewing. Now, depending on the type of insect, the majority of this leaf chewing can involve either the larval stage of the insect or the adult. It just depends on what insect we're talking about. And this occurs when the insect is, as the name suggests, chewing on the leaves and actually removing that leaf tissue completely. Sometimes in earlier instars of these insects, they'll only defoliate or chew on that leaf tissue between the veins. And then sometimes as the insects progress in age, they can chew right through the veins of the leaf and consume the entire leaf itself. The other type of foliar feeding that we talk about a lot is skeletonizing. Skeletonizing is just a really cool word. I like to think of it as a stained glass window. And essentially what happens is the insect itself is usually feeding on the bottom half of that leaf and leaving only the major veins and the upper epidermis of that leaf. So it's removing all of that green tissue and thereby removing the leaf's ability to photosynthesize and produce energy and starches for the plant. So it leaves this sort of stained glass window look that you see in that middle photo, leaving only the veins of the leaf itself. And then finally, leaf mining. We touched on this earlier. Leaf miners are types of insects that usually feed between the two layers of the leaf. So they're able to go between the upper and lower epidermis of the leaf and actually, as the name suggests, mine out all of that green tissue. Again, further contributing in that decline and limiting photosynthetic ability of that plant. So a couple of quick facts. Leaf-feeding insects also include caterpillars, beetles, and grasshoppers. But today we're going to be talking about the ones that focus primarily on landscape plants and the ones that we deal with a lot and the ones that we have to manage a lot in urban landscapes. We see the damage usually on the foliage of the plants that are attacked. Usually when it's a foliar feeding insect, we'll see it only there. We won't also see damage from that specific insect on things like bark and roots. It'll primarily just be on the foliage of the plant. And then finally, feeding of these types of insects typically occurs on new or tender growth. It's easier for the insect to actually chew through, and it's also easier to digest and has a higher nutrient content. So it's a little bit more appealing to the insect to feed on that new growth. However, we do have some insects that will focus on older or mature growth. It depends on the insect. And when we're talking about this, the reason why it's so important to understand this is based on where that insect is feeding can be a key distinguishing factor of what type of insect you're dealing with. And as we know with integrated pest management, we want to understand the insect that we're dealing with in order for us to be able to treat it the right way with the right products. So again, where that insect is feeding, whether it be on new growth or old growth, can be a key for us to be able to diagnose the pest that we're actually working with. Again, these insects consume this leaf tissue, usually this new growth. And what does that cause? Typically, we see impacts in reduced overall growth. So as the insects are feeding on that foliar tissue, we see reduced photosynthetic material, thereby reducing the overall energy stores within that plant. And that can cause reduced growth, either in shoot growth, also in DBH in some cases. We also will see reduced root development. So plants that are heavily fed on in foliage have to put a lot of energy to regrowing or resprouting that foliage. And that takes away the energy or the plant's ability to put out that root and that shoot growth. And then finally, overall, when we see repeated defoliation in some of these plants, we see a decrease in carbohydrate storage, which can also impact the plant's ability to overwinter correctly, which is, again, vital in some of our northern climates. So what is the cost of all of this damage, and what are we going to see as landscape managers? Primarily, and obviously, we're going to see aesthetic loss of the tree and also these ornamental plants, okay? Sometimes this heavy feeding and this defoliation, both on the leaves and sometimes on the flowers, which we'll cover in just 1 minute, can lead to significant aesthetic loss and decline of these plants. And a lot of these plants we're managing for aesthetic value. So that can be a significant contributing factor. We also have the cost to replace these plants. Sometimes, in cases of heavy infestation and repeat defoliation, the plant can actually die. And the cost of replacing these plants can be quite costly, especially if you're managing for aesthetic purposes. And then additionally, we have cost of retreatments. So in higher areas of defoliation or in higher populations, maybe even outbreak populations, we have to go back and retreat maybe several times a year, depending on the pest, and that can be quite costly. And then finally, if it's bad enough, if the defoliation is bad enough, we can have a decrease in property value overall and also in client satisfaction, which is something we want to be mindful of. So now that we've covered different types of feeding, it's important to switch the lens and talk about the need for an alternative. We have a lot of products in our toolbox with IPM that we can use or apply to any pests that we have in the landscape. But we're seeing a shift in current markets and current industry. And we're seeing the strength and the push for finding products that have lower impacts on pollinator health. Okay, these being neonicotinoid alternatives. We hear about it a lot in the media that we have decrease in pollinator populations really worldwide, and neonics can be a contributing factor to some of these declines in populations. So we really need a product that can have a reduced impact on pollinator presence and their general health. Additionally, we're also seeing increase in regulatory restrictions, okay, this coming from both the state level and the federal level. We have regulatory restrictions that are popping up and changing almost weekly at this point that are focusing more of our efforts towards these more pollinator or bee-friendly solutions. Additionally, some states are just banning some active materials outright for other reasons as well. So these are things that we need to be mindful of when we're talking about the need for a solution or a tool in our toolbox. Next, we talk about the increased demand for human and pet safe products. We get questions weekly about dogs or animals that have been in an area that have been treated with a product. And it's important that we can offer our clients an option that is safe, both for the applicator as well as for any animals or even children that might be in that area. And then finally, the cost of competitive products. Products that are currently on the market that might fit this niche are quite expensive, and usually the price tag will deter people from bringing it on or including it into their IPM toolbox. And that brings us today to Diamid T&O, Diamid Turf and Ornamental. Now, this is a new product that Rainbow has brought on. We had a previous webinar by Mark Ware. He did a fantastic job introducing the product, some of its regulatory and label background, and that's posted on our YouTube channel. So if you're interested in diving a little bit more into that, please feel free to go to our YouTube channel and you can find that quick 30-minute session by Mark. He did a fantastic job introducing the product. But today we're going to talk about how we can use it and where it fits in your toolbox. So Diamid T&O is a group 28 product, okay? It's a diamide. Its active ingredient is chlorantraniliprole, okay? So that one is a mouthful and a lot of people struggle with that one, but chlorantraniliprole. Now, chlorantraniliprole is widely used in agriculture as well. You'll see it a lot in row crop use. This is not new or novel to the market as an active ingredient. However, in this formulation and at the level of active ingredient that we offer in Diamid, this is new. There are no other products on the market that have this level of active ingredient. It can be applied in several different ways. It can be applied foliarly or as a turf spray. It can also be applied as a soil injection or a soil drench. And in just a minute, we're going to go through some of the options that you have or some of the pests that you might be treating and where you're going to use some of these different application types. And then finally, it's highly effective on chewing pests, which is what we're focusing on today. We see low impact on non-target organisms. So very low impact on piercing sucking insects, but specifically very low impact on pollinating insects. And we'll talk about why in just one second. So I'd like to dive into the science behind it and really what's working here, because I think when we talk about what's in the bottle, we miss the background information and maybe some of the research that goes into it. And I also like to nerd out about this a little bit. So I want to talk a little bit about the mode of action of diamide or a diamide product, okay? And what exactly is happening to the insect when you're applying this. And with this, you'll also understand why it's so selective to chewing insects and not our non-target insects. So within the product, we have something called a ryanodine receptor activator. It's another mouthful, okay? Ryanodine receptor activators, like Diamid T&O, target an insect's muscle, okay? So it targets the actual muscle tissue of the insect itself. Inside every single muscle cell within that insect, there is something called a calcium gate, and we call that the ryanodine receptor, and that's right here in the center where that pink part meets that gray part, okay? Now these ryanodine receptors opens and closes to let calcium in and out of that muscle cell, which tells the muscle really when to move, when to contract, and that goes into every function of the insect, how it flies, how it crawls, how it eats, how it's able to reproduce. So within every one of these muscles that has to do with the insect actually being able to live, you have these calcium gates that are opening and closing, allowing those muscles to contract, just like you and I. What happens though, when we apply these insecticides, it actually flips that calcium gate open, and it flips it permanently open. So this causes the insect's muscles to actually lock up and stop working. So it's not able to control its muscular movement the way that it used to before it was exposed to this product. The insect then, after feeding on this insecticide, it has to consume it. It stops feeding after that calcium gate is actually flipped open permanently. It'll stop feeding and it'll usually soon die shortly after exposure. Usually this happens because of exhaustion or dehydration. And that's just because the insect isn't able to move like it usually can. This is what makes this mode of action so valuable on things like pollinators, pets, and even people, because it provides this long-lasting protection with this low environmental risk, making it really a smart fit for a lot of healthcare programs. And I say it's a beautiful thing. So how does this come back to pollinators? Ryanodine receptors are more sensitive in insects with chewing mouth parts. So as we know, our pollinator species don't have chewing mouth parts, okay? They have sort of like a tongue that's able to lap up a lot of the pollen and nectar in some of the plants that it's feeding on. And these ryanodine receptors are not as sensitive in these pollinator species. We see that pollinators, because of this, are typically less sensitive or susceptible to diamides, such as Diamid T&O. And we see that bees, when bees are feeding, depending on where they're feeding on the plant, they're not feeding on the part of the plant that this insecticide is being applied to. So bees aren't feeding on things like leaves and roots of the plant. They're feeding in the flowers. So what's the target? I wanted to break this talk down into 3 different sections for us to step through, okay? The first one we're going to talk about is Lepidopteran pests. So these are our moths and butterflies. The next one being Coleopteran pests, so these are our beetles, and then finally our Hymenopteran pests, or our sawflies. Now these are the 3 main groups that we see Diamid is most effective on, and you'll also see this represented in the Diamid label itself. So how can we integrate this, and what does this look like from a management perspective, boots on the ground? The first group we're going to talk about is Coleoptera. So these are our beetle pests, okay? These are all of the beetle pests that you're going to find on the Diamid product label. And they range from several ornamental pests, so things that we're going to see on our shrubs, our roses, our trees, all the way down to turf pests. Now, again, this product is labeled for turf and ornamental, okay? So there's going to be some introduction to turf management. It's not my specialty and it's not my background, but I'm going to do my best today. So ornamental pests look like Japanese beetle, viburnum leaf beetle, Asiatic garden beetle, green June beetle, and May and June beetles. And then we also have several different turf pests, like several different species of grubs. Today we're going to focus on Japanese beetle, and I wanted to focus on this one because I feel like everybody has at least a general introduction to Japanese beetle. Most people in the US have seen damage from Japanese beetle either on their plants or in their turf. So I'm going to do a little bit of a case study background, and then we're going to talk about how you can use Diamid T&O to control Japanese beetle in the landscape. So Japanese beetle was accidentally introduced in 1916. Okay, now it was brought over in, we think, nursery stock from Japan. So it's not native to North America. It was first detected in New Jersey, and it's currently established in about 28 states. It's been detected in an additional 13. Hasn't established in those additional 13 states, but it has been detected. Because it's not native to North America, it lacks a natural predator from its native range, okay? So because it came over from Japan, we don't have a natural predator to keep these populations in check when we see these outbreak populations. Typically, this insect is a pest of ornamentals. That's where we see it a lot, but it's also a pest of turf. So this one is interesting. We're going to go over its life cycle in just 1 minute, but we'll see the impacts in an outbreak year on both the turf of a landscape as well as the plants that it's feeding on. And it can actually feed on over 300 species of ornamental and agricultural plants. So it has quite a broad host range. It is a generalist. So these are 3 photos that will show feeding of Japanese beetle in different areas, okay? And you can see it in any one of these areas. The first one where I see it a lot is leaf feeding, okay? So we see it's a complete defoliator. It will feed on all of the leaves, avoiding those veins when it can. And then we'll also see it impact flowers. We see this a lot on roses, where it'll actually consume the whole flower itself. And then finally, we see it a lot in turf damage. Now, the turf damage is a little bit difficult to diagnose in itself. And we'll talk in just 1 minute a few different ways that you can diagnose Japanese beetle as a turf, a damaging turf insect. So this is a general life cycle of Japanese beetle, okay? And this is going to change a little bit depending on where you are. If you're in southern states, it might shift up a little bit. In northern states, you might see it shift to the right a little bit. But during their feeding periods, about 4 to 6 weeks, females will actually intermittently leave the plant, burrow about 3 inches into the ground to lay their eggs. And I'm going to show you a photo of their eggs in just 1 minute. Then they will return to the plant and continue to feed. So it's kind of this cyclical. They'll go up and down throughout their adult life cycle. This cycle is repeated until the female lays about 40 to 60 eggs. So about 40 to 60 eggs per female. By midsummer, the eggs then hatch and the young grubs, or the larval stage, which is what we see within the soil here, begin to feed. They will actually feed on things like tree roots, plant roots, and especially turf roots. When full grown, each grub is about 1 inch in length and will usually lie in a curled position, much like the photo depicts here. In late autumn, grubs will burrow about 4 to 8 inches deeper and remain completely inactive for the majority of the winter. So they overwinter deep within the ground. Then in early spring, they're able to crawl up through the soil and feed on tender turf roots. That's where we see that turf damage in early spring. And about 2 weeks later, the pupae become adult, and then they're able to emerge from the ground. So you're likely able to see adults emerge from late spring through early summer, and that'll occur around 1,000 growing degree days. So here's a photo of the eggs. The eggs are just a very small, white, almost waxy looking egg. And again, you're going to find that a couple of inches into the turf. You're going to have to do some excavation. The adults, as the image depicts in the photo there, adult beetles have this beautiful shiny metallic color, and they're metallic green bodies with almost a bronze-like outer wing. Okay, so their elytra is this bronze, beautiful bronze color. Now, these guys are really easy to identify based on these white tufts of hair that you see coming out of their abdomen. So you'll see 6 small tufts of white hair along the sides and the back of their bodies, really right under the edges of their wings. And again, the larval stages are just this C-shaped white grub with a brown head capsule. So how does chlorantraniliprole work to control Japanese beetle? This is a study that looked at overall amount or total leaf tissue eaten by Japanese beetles when treated with different active ingredients. Okay, so in all of these graphs, you have total area of leaf tissue eaten on the y-axis, so going up and down, that's in centimeters squared. And then you have age residue over days. So how long are we able to control Japanese beetle feeding? What we found was chlorantraniliprole significantly reduced Japanese beetle feeding on linden foliage with strong statistical support across multiple residue ages and application rates. So when chlorantraniliprole is applied at recommended label rates, we see a long control of about 21 days in chlorantraniliprole treated plants. So how do we integrate this into our PHC toolbox? Chlorantraniliprole is applied as a foliar spray. It's not completely systemic at this time. So we apply this product using a spray gun. We're able to completely cover the foliage of the plant that we're treating. We want to use a mix rate for Japanese beetle between 2 and 4 fluid ounces per 100 gallons. Okay, so you don't need a lot of this product. We typically want to begin applications right before onset of high pest populations. And when I say high pest populations, I'm focusing specifically on that adult emergence. Okay, so right before those adults begin to really gain population pressure and start to emerge to feed on those plants. Now, this happens around 1,000 growing degree days, like I mentioned, and you want to use a retreatment interval of about 12 to 21 days. Now, if you're not familiar with growing degree days, you can use things like phenological indicators, and you can also use things like just historical knowledge of pest presence in this area. If you know that you're typically seeing adults emerge or adults damaging these plants around a certain time of year, you can use that to really inform when you should be applying this product next year. And again, Japanese beetle is one of those interesting ones where we also see the damage in the turf. Now we see the damage in the turf usually later on in the year, around 1,300 growing degree days. Now, when we're doing turf applications, we want to do a soil application, okay? So we're broad applying this product as a soil treatment because that's where these insects are overwintering. For this, we want to mix 0.09 to 0.18 fluid ounces per 1,000 square feet. Again, there's not a lot of volume needed of this product itself. And again, you want to begin applications immediately prior to egg hatch. So right before that egg hatch occurs, you want to start those applications so that as soon as those larvae come out and start feeding, they're hit with that chlorantraniliprole product. And then finally, you can reapply this product, always following label recommendations for acreages restrictions, but you want to retreat as needed based on historical monitoring and insect activity. So follow the growing degree days when you can, but if you don't actively monitor growing degree days, you could always use historical egg hatch as a good rule of thumb for retreatment. The next group of insects we're going to focus on are lepidopteran insects. So these are our moths and butterflies, okay? And there are a number of different lepidopteran insects that are included on this product's label, and they include things like bagworms, eastern tent caterpillar, tussock moth, which is a really big issue this year, fall webworm, and even spongy moth caterpillar. First, we're going to focus on spongy moth. Spongy moth is one of my favorite insects. It causes a lot of issues and a lot of damage throughout northeastern US as well as into Canada. Now, this insect, spongy moth, was formerly known as gypsy moth, and it was renamed spongy moth actually quite recently because of its spongy egg masses, and I'll show you a photo of that in just one second. Now, spongy moth, similar to Japanese beetle, is not native to the US, so it lacks that natural predator that's really able to knock down those populations. Spongy moth was introduced in 1969. It was actually introduced by a French scientist up in Massachusetts, And they were interested in breeding a hardier silkworm. So they were interested in bringing over spongy moth in order to improve the silkworm industry here in the US. Unfortunately, some of the moths escaped and established populations in the area, and from there they just spread. So they are now all through the Northeast, the Midwest, and again, parts of Canada. This is a general life cycle of spongy moth. And this, again, is going to change depending on where you are, depending on the climate. In more southern climates, you're going to see a slight shift in this life cycle, but this is a general example. You're going to see the egg masses in August to May. Again, they're spongy texture. I'll show you a better photo here in just one second. After that, you're going to see the caterpillars begin to emerge and start to feed. In some areas of high infestations, you will see significant populations of caterpillars. They will be everywhere. You'll see them at the base of the tree. You'll see them in crotches of trees. They will be everywhere. In high pest pressure years, you will not miss these spongy moth caterpillars. From there, they enter into their pupa stage around June or July, and then they emerge around July or August as adults. Now, here is an example of those egg masses that I was telling you about. And this is really where we named it spongy moth. Okay, now what happens, the female adult on the left side, she's actually flightless. So she does not fly around. She's pretty immobile on the tree. And once she mates, she will actually lay her eggs and cover the egg mass with the velvet from her abdomen. So she'll rub the velvet off of her belly to produce that beige, almost velvet mass over top to protect the eggs. And they're about the size, a little bit larger than a penny. Now, a single egg mass can contain anywhere from 500 to 1,000 eggs, and females can lay up to 100 egg masses in their lifetime. Unfortunately, in high pest pressure areas, we will see spongy moth lay their eggs pretty much anywhere. You'll see it on the siding of houses, you'll see it on cars, on patio furniture. They will put these egg masses pretty much anywhere. In lower pest pressure areas, you'll see them mostly on the bark of impacted trees. Now, the most destructive part of the spongy moth life cycle is their feeding stage, so their larval stage. Okay, and this is a really great photo that shows you what they look like up close. Spongy moth caterpillars have a blue-black color and a very hairy body, as we can see. They're typically identified by 5 pairs of blue spots, followed by 6 pairs of red spots down their back. When they first hatch, the caterpillars are actually quite small, about 1/4 of an inch in length, and then they can grow to about 2 inches long. This is a photo of a side-by-side of male and female. Again, the female body mass is actually quite larger than the male, and they're flightless. They just hang out on the tree for the majority of their life. And then the male can actually fly to find those females. They do this via location pheromones. And this is a good side-by-side size comparison of those insects. Now, spongy moth can move around in a number of different ways. As I said, in high pest pressure areas, you're going to find them on tires, on house siding, as you can see here in this middle photo. But they move, majority move as their caterpillar stage, and they can actually balloon. So they'll send out a piece of silk, and they can balloon from one area to the other. And then the photo on the right, you can see very high pest pressure in some areas. Again, you won't miss it. They're pretty obvious. And now these pests, again, are foliar feeding insects, and the larval stage will actually completely defoliate trees. They really, really like oaks. And in high enough pest pressure areas, high enough populations, you'll see they'll completely defoliate and even feed right through the veins on the leaf. Now, how does chlorantiniliprole control, or how well does it control spongy moth? We wanted to look at chlorantiniliprole or Diamid T&O versus other products on the market like Acelepryn. So we applied both Acelepryn and Diamid T&O to varying trees. Treatment 1 that you see here in this table is Acelepryn, and treatment 2 is Diamid. We then took leaf samples from treated trees at 6, 24, and 48 days after. We took leaf punches, and then we put them in a petri dish and allowed the larvae to feed on these leaf discs. And we found that Diamid T&O is just as effective over time as Acelepryn is at controlling spongy moth caterpillar populations. So how can we integrate this and what does application look like? So management of spongy moth with Diamid T&O, again, is a foliar spray. We want to apply it to the foliage of the plant that insect is feeding off of. Again, the larval stage of spongy moth is the one that's doing all that feeding and that damage. For spongy moth, we want to mix about 1/2 to 4 fluid ounces per 100 gallons. And this is a great alternative to products like Upstart Gold, Bifin XTS, and even 10 Guard. We have a couple of different options in our toolbox that we can use to control spongy moth, and they also include Lepitect and Mectinite. Lepitect is a great option as a soil application. So this can be applied as a soil application, and it actually moves systemically throughout the tree. So for a soil application of Lepitect, we want to apply about 2 to 5 ounces or 5.7 grams of product per DBH inch of trees over 15 inches, okay? Just read and follow the label for this one. It's pretty direct on the label for application for this. And finally, Mectinite is also an option. We want to apply low to high rates based on tree DBH. So again, always read and follow the label. And we want to apply this at least 2 to 3 weeks before pest has historically been present. You can use growing degree days for this, or again, you can just do population monitoring to advise you when to apply these products. The next lepidopteran pest we're going to talk about is bagworm. Now, bagworm is something that really impacts a lot of landscapes throughout the US. And bagworm has several different host species. Now you can see a photo of the insect on the right. They're kind of cute little bugs. The larva stages of bagworms actually feed on the foliage of the plant, and then they build their own little houses with it. So the bag that you see is actually like the house for that insect itself, okay? Now the females live in there, they lay their eggs in there, and the eggs hatch out of that bag that they build. A lot like something like a caddisfly, if you're familiar with those. Now, these species of bagworms are native to the US, so they do have some natural predators, but we do see outbreak populations in a lot of areas. I live in southern Alabama. We see them a lot in Alabama and Mississippi. Now, initial feeding usually is on the branch tips, and what we'll see if we can't pick up the bagworm itself, we'll see browning of the branch tips throughout the tree, sometimes on the upper portion of the tree. And in severe cases, we can see stripping of the foliage, which can actually cause branch decline and sometimes even plant death in high enough populations. This is a photo, or this is a slide that shows you the different life stages of bagworm. Again, the one on the left is the larval stage. So we see the insect is actually holding onto the branch by a piece of silk. And it's built that kind of home around itself from all of the pieces of the plant that it's consuming. In the middle, we see the adult of the bagworm, and they're actually quite pretty. They have almost like glass, stained glass wings. And then finally, we see what happens if you open up one of those bagworm little houses. We see the actual larvae and then some of the eggs of the bagworm itself. So how does chlorantraniliprole tee up to bagworm populations? In this study, again, we wanted to look at the number of dead bagworm larvae after 48 hours of treating. So that's what we see on that y-axis going up and down. And we wanted to look at it in 2 different groups of bagworms. So medium-sized bagworms as well as large larvae, okay? And what we found was chlorantraniliprole reduced bagworm survival feeding within 48 hours of feeding. So it was able to overall reduce feeding capability and reduce populations within 48 hours of being exposed to this chlorantraniliprole product, or this Diamid product. Diamid was more effective against larger larvae when compared to other neonicotinoid alternatives, which is really exciting. So it holds up really, really well with larger larvae as well as small larvae and over time. So how do we use it to manage bagworm? So Diamid T&O, again, we can apply it as a foliar spray. We want to apply it where that insect is feeding, which is the foliage. We want to apply about 2 fluid ounce per 100 gallons. And we want to apply it preventatively or after caterpillars have been observed. So if we're starting to see those bags, we can apply that product then, or we can do it before historical emergence of this insect. We can also use products like Lepitect. Lepitect can be applied as a soil application at about 2 ounces per DBH inch for trees greater than 15 inches. And we want to do that 2 weeks prior to outbreak. Because Lepitect is a soil applied product and it has to move systemically throughout the tree, we want to make sure that we're applying it before we see the insects so that product can get into the tree and effectively control populations when those insects emerge. And for this, we want to reapply every 30 to 45 days. And then finally, products like mectinite can be applied via trunk injection. And we want to refer to the label based on tree size for this one. The label is a little bit more intricate for this, but we want to apply it right after leaf out. And this one can be applied annually. The final group of insects we'll talk about are Hymenoptera. Now, the Hymenoptera species on the Diamid label includes sawfly larvae, a very broad group of larvae. But today we're going to talk about bristly rose slug sawfly. Now, as the name suggests, they're these small, little green, almost caterpillar looking slugs, and they have these spikes or spines or hairs on their body. Now, the bristly rose slug sawfly is native to Europe. It was introduced into North America. So again, we have lower predator populations that's able to really keep these populations in check. Now, larvae typically emerge in late spring with first activity around 300 to 400 growing degree days. We see this on several different rose species as well as other ornamental plants. And this feeds and causes a skeletonized appearance. Now, we covered over different types of foliar feeding earlier. The skeletonizing is when they feed on the lower epidermis of the leaf and remove all of that green tissue, leaving only the veins on the upper epidermis. So we can see that in the photo on the right. It causes this stained glass looking appearance to impacted plants. Now, we see usually about 2 to 3 generations per year of this pest, but again, that's going to depend where you are and what the climate is like. And again, despite the name, they're not true slugs. These are sawfly larvae, and they resemble just small, green, almost bristly caterpillars. Now, how does Diamid T&O control bristly rose slug larvae? Residual control of bristly rose slug larvae and their feeding damage by sprayed field weather residues of chlorantraniliprole or Diamid T&O on rose foliage when compared to untreated checks. The pre-sprayed shoots were harvested after the respective weathering intervals and challenged with separate cohorts of similar sized larvae. So essentially, we applied similar sized larvae, different cohorts. All on the same day. Note the residual efficacy of chlorantraniliprole versus other alternatives. Within residue ages means not topped, and the same letter means that they're not significantly different. So as we can see here on our y-axis, we have the total number of larvae that are dead. This is out of a total of 5 larvae that were fed at one time. And we can see 3-day, 7-day, 14-day, and 21-day after application. And with this, we can see great control by chlorantraniliprole or by Diamid T&O after application. And again, this is a great alternative to products like Zytec or Transtect in areas where neonics are restricted. So how can we manage bristly rose slug? Again, this is applied via foliar spray. We want to apply it where the insect is feeding. We want to mix 1 to 2 fluid ounces per 100 gallons. We want to begin applications again before the onset of this pest. So just before the onset of this pest, that way it's covering the foliage when the pest emerges and starts to feed. And we want to reapply as needed. It's a general loose rule with this and always following acreage rules. Now, one of the last groups we're going to go over is bark application. Now, this is a little bit of a different application type. It's something that a lot of people don't use with a product like Diamid T&O, but it's a great option and a great thing to add to your toolbox. So Diamid T&O can also be used as a contact bark application, and it can be used to control and prevent things like clearwing borer larvae. So these are clearwing borer larvae that bore into the main stem of a lot of trees and shrubs in our landscape. And these include things like peach tree and lesser peach tree borer, dogwood borer, lilac borer, and banded ash borer. And again, this is just a preventative application. We can apply it to the bark itself and try and deter, prevent infestation by those insects. We want to apply this at a 2 to 16 ounce rate per 100 gallons. And we want to use the 16 ounce rate for maximum residual control. So using the higher rate, applying it to the bark to get that maximal control of these populations. The final thing we're going to go over today is turf uses. Again, I'm going to give my best shot at this. So again, Diamid T&O, as the name suggests, can be used as a turf application product. We wanted to look at it and see how it can control things like grub populations. These grub populations are typically found in turf or managed turf areas. And we see the impact in browning turf, and it can sometimes look like a skunk was digging, or it can sometimes look like a fungal impacted area. But when you peel back that turf, it'll almost roll back on itself because all of those grubs have eaten up all of the roots that are holding that turf down or holding the grass down. So we wanted to look at application of chlorantranoloprol and how well it can control these grub populations. So in the graph on the right, we see larval control in percentage. So that's the y-axis going up and down. And then we wanted to look at it as a preventative treatment, an early curative treatment, and a late curative treatment. And in this, they looked at chlorantranoloprol, so Diamid, also looked at a number of different other active ingredients, including imidacloprid, which is one that we use a lot in landscapes. We found that in preventative control, applications made between May and June, applications made well before grub egg hatch. So this is well before those grubs are able to hatch and actually emerge. With curative treatments applied between July and August, these are applications after egg hatch, but before late instar larvae and development. And with late curative treatments, these treatments were applied September to October, and these were applications targeting the mature larvae that are feeding within that turf. And what we found is overall, chlorantranoloprol was one of the most effective products in controlling grub populations across all of these different time zones. So just to summarize, wrapping up the talk today, chewing pests are a serious and growing issue. Okay, we're seeing an increase in chewing pests within the landscape, and we're seeing an increase in invasive chewing insects within the landscape as well. We are also seeing regulatory and public pressure moving the industry away from these neonicotinoid products. And so we see the need to offer some of our clients neonicotinoid alternatives such as Diamid T&O. We see Diamid T&O provides effective and long-lasting and pollinator bee-friendly control. And then finally, as we've gone over today, Diamid is an easy product to apply. It can be applied using equipment that you already have, using application methods that you are already using. And it's very easy to integrate into your PHC programs for things like root and foliar feeding pests. Now, again, always read and follow the label. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. The QR code on the left is my contact information. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions that might come up after this talk. And then the QR code on the right will take you to our landing website that will show you a little bit more information about Diamid T&O, including its label if you want to do a little bit more digging there. So again, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate you hopping on, and hopefully you learned a few things. I'm going to hop on over to the Q&A box and see if there's any questions that I can answer for you guys. So it looks like we have a lot of ISA numbers. Again, if you did not submit your ISA number when you registered, please go ahead and do that, and we'll make sure that we submit that on your behalf. Okay, we have one question. Does Diamid move systemically into the plant? Or if not, does it remain on the surface of the leaves? Does it get washed off by rain? That's a great question. So Diamid is not able at this time to move systemically within the plant. There are some studies that show that it's able to move into smaller plants, but that's not something that we've been able to work out in order for that to be a predictable application method for you. So as of now, the product is labeled for foliar application only. So it doesn't move systemically if you apply it via soil application. So we do foliar applications of the product. It remains on the surface of the leaf, and it has a fantastic rain fastness. So the rain fastness of this product has been studied, and it does not get washed off immediately by rain. Okay, so I hope I answered your question. If you have a follow-up question, let me know. So it doesn't look like we have any more questions. I'm going to give it a couple more minutes for folks to pop in their questions in the Q&A box. The chat is disabled. So go ahead and pop those in if you have any, but if not, thank you again for joining today. I really appreciate you taking the time, and please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any further questions. So I have one question. So no need for a surfactant. There's no need for a surfactant with this product. There might be some research that shows that a surfactant will just increase efficacy, but as of now, there's no guidance that demands that. Is there risk of phytotoxicity if conditions are hot and dry? I would always shy away if you're in a severe drought of applying anything to the foliage of the plant. But generally speaking, even if you're in a moderate drought or if it's dry, there is no risk of phytotoxicity that we know of. Can I get the slideshow emailed to me? My connection was unstable and I wasn't able to see some. Absolutely, we can send that to you. Alrighty, y'all. Well, I don't see any more questions coming in right now. So again, thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate it. You have a great rest of your week.